Hey guys, today I'll be teaching you how to create this 80s style retro text effect using Adobe Photoshop so that you can use it on your own custom text, whether it's for professional work or for an Instagram post. Now before we start, I just want to thank Squarespace for sponsoring this video. I personally use Squarespace to create and host my websites, and I highly recommend it to anyone looking to get a website or an online portfolio. Make sure you stick around to get 10% off your first Squarespace order. Alright, so we're going to start by creating a new Photoshop document. We can make this one 2000 by 2000 pixels, and you can set the resolution to 72 pixels per inch and use RGB for the color mode. And you can leave the background color to whatever it's at. Now that our document's ready, we can go ahead and set the background color. This kind of effect works best on a darker background because of the different blending modes we're going to be using to create the lighting effect, so just keep that in mind when selecting your base background color. So let's go down here to the adjustment layers and select solid color. I'm going to be going for a purple and pink color palette for this piece, so I'll set the background color to a very dark purple using the hex value 0C0D20. And I'll just rename this layer to background. And you can get rid of this original background layer. Now to get this overall retro feel, we can add some dust particles and a bit of grain to the image. I've added a download link to the dust image I'll be using in the video description, so you guys can save that to your desktop and then drag it to your workspace as a smart object. And then just make sure it sits right above the background layer. Then we can resize it to fit the canvas. So let's bring up the transform tool by pressing Command or Control T, and then grab one of these control points to resize the image. Just make sure to keep Shift pressed while doing this so that everything scales up proportionally. Alright, now we're going to set the blending mode to Vivid Light. Now let's go ahead and simulate image grain by adding some noise. So let's create a new layer by clicking on this little icon, and then bring up the fill menu by hitting Shift and backspace. You can also bring it up by going to Edit and then Fill. Now in the Contents drop-down menu, I'm going to select 50% gray and leave the rest as is and hit OK. Next, let's go up here to Filter and then go to Noise and select Add Noise. Let's set the amount to 12%. We can select Uniform for the distribution, which is a bit more subtle, and check Monochromatic, that way the noise is limited to black and white, which helps simulate an old camera grain effect instead of having RGB pixels, which would give more of a digital feel. Alright, so hit OK. Now we can set the blending mode to Divide, and bring the opacity down to 50%. And I'll just rename this layer. Now I want both the dust and grain layers to sit above all the other layers so that they'll affect not only the background but also the text later on. So I'm going to group those two layers to keep everything organized. So I'll select both of them by keeping Command or Control pressed and then selecting them both. Now I can group them by pressing Command or Control G. And then I'll rename the group. Alright, now let's start working on the text. So in this piece we have two levels of text going on. The word outrun up here, and then the word retro with the chrome effect. We'll start from the top, so I'll bring up the type tool by pressing T, and I'll write down the word outrun. For this part, I'm using a free font called Road Rage. I'll leave a download link in the video description so that you guys can use the same one. I'll just make it a little bit bigger by bringing up the transform tool and scaling it up proportionally. Now this font has two variations depending on whether you're using upper or lowercase. So I'll be using the lowercase version for most of the letters except for the O and the N. Just because I like the uppercase version for those two better, but that's just personal preference. So I'll keep Shift pressed when I type in those two letters. And let's just place the text layer right between the background and the dust layers. Now I'll select the word and change the color to a bright pink. So let's go down here to the layer styles and select color overlay. Now we can set the color by clicking on this little color thumbnail here. So I'm going to use a pink color with the hex value C52644. And again, this is just the color scheme I'm going with, but feel free to use whichever color you want. Alright, now let's add an outer glow effect to give it that neon vibe. So I'll go down here to the effects and select outer glow. In this case, it was already selected in this side panel, which is why it's grayed out. So select outer glow right here. Let's set the blend mode to normal and the opacity to around 40%. And leave the noise at 0. Then I want the color to be a bit more red than the fill color of the text, just out of personal preference. So I'll use the hex value EA1B38 and hit OK. I'll leave the spread at 0 and set the size to around 45 pixels. And you can leave the rest as is and hit OK. Alright, now let's move on to the second word. So I'll write down the word retro, and for this one I'll be using a free font called Plateia, for which I'll also leave a download link in the video description. And I'll just scale it up a bit. Now I usually don't recommend distorting fonts. It's kind of a bad practice when working with typography, but in this case I find the font to be a bit too wide, so I'm going to go ahead and compress it. So I'm going to keep Alt pressed so that everything scales down towards the center, and then compress the word. Okay, now again, just to keep everything clean, I'm going to select both words and group them together by pressing Command G, and this will be my text group. And I also want the outrun word to be on top, so I'll move this layer above this one. So now I'll go ahead and convert the retro text to a smart object, since we'll be duplicating it a bunch of times and adding lots of layer effects. By doing this, I'll be able to edit the smart object in the future if I want to change the text, for example, and all the effects will automatically adjust. I'm not sure if this makes sense to you guys right now, but I'll show you what I mean later on. So I'll go to the retro text layer and then right click on it and select Convert to Smart Object. Now we can go ahead and work on the outline for the chrome effect. So let's bring down the fill value to 0 up here. Now go down here to the layer styles and select stroke. Now let's set the size to around 15 pixels. Set the position to center and leave the blend mode to normal and the opacity to 100%. Now set the fill type to gradient and select the third one over here, so black to white. Set the style to reflected and make sure align with layer is checked. Set the angle to 90 degrees and the scale to 115%. Alright, now let's add in some outer glow to the text. So select outer glow right over here. You can set the color to this hex value, D6C5EC. Set the blend mode to vivid light and bring the opacity to 30%. Now set the noise to 18% and the size to 125% and leave the rest as is and hit OK. Now I've been messing around with all these values and I'm just giving you guys the ones I find to look good in my opinion. But none of these values I'm giving you are set in stone, it's all based on personal preference. So feel free to try out different values until you're satisfied with the results. Alright, now let's move on to the inner chrome effect. We'll start by making a copy of this retro layer, so make sure it's selected and then hit Command or Control J and you should see a copy sitting right above the original one. Now since we're going to be creating quite a few layers for this word, I'll create some sub-layer groups so that I don't get lost through all the layers. I'll start by selecting both retro layers and group them, so I know that everything within this group has to do with the word retro. Now this is going to be the outline layer, so I'll rename it to outline. And I'll make another subgroup for the chrome effect. This is the layer I'm going to be using for the chrome effect, so I'll just select this one and group it by itself for now and rename this group to chrome. Alright, now for the chrome part, I won't be needing the stroke on this layer, so I'll grab the effect right here where it says effect and drag that to the trash can. And I'll bring back the fill to 100%. Now I want to set my base text color to black. So I'll double click right here on the Smart Object thumbnail, which is going to bring up my original text in a separate PSD. Over here I can change the text color to black. So I'll bring up the type tool by pressing T and then select the text and double click on the foreground color here to change it to black. I can now save this PSD by pressing Command or Control S and then close it up here. As you can see, the text color is now changed. Okay, now let's create a new layer by clicking down here and then bring up the rectangular tool by pressing U. Then set the foreground color to white and drag a rectangle that roughly covers the lower half of your text. Then add a layer mask by clicking on this icon down here. Now make sure you have the layer mask selected over here and bring up the gradient tool by pressing G. Make sure your foreground color is set to white and your background color is set to black. Now click and drag your mouse down to create a gradient that goes from up to down. You can hold Shift while doing that to make sure you drag down in a straight line. Once you're satisfied with the gradient, you can go ahead and create a clipping mask. So make sure you have your white gradient selected and then go up here to Layer and select Create Clipping Mask. Now your gradient only affects the underneath layer and nothing else. You can move your gradient up or down to make it more or less apparent by again having your gradient layer selected and then bringing up the move tool by pressing V. And then pressing the up or down arrows on your keyboard. And you can hold Shift to make it move in higher increments. Okay, now let's duplicate this layer by pressing Command or Control J. And then we can get rid of this layer mask, so just drag it to the trash can. Now let's move this rectangle so that it covers the upper half of the text. Make sure that you have the move tool selected by pressing V and then just move the rectangle up. Now we could make another straight gradient with this one, but I find it looks better if we make it wavy instead of straight. So I'll go to Filter up here and then Distort and select Wave. Then I'll select Convert to Smart Object. I'll set the number of generators to 5 and then leave Sign for the type. Now we can set the minimum wavelength at 59 and the max at 60. And then set the minimum amplitude at 5 and the max at 25. Then leave the horizontal scale at 100% and the vertical scale to 30%. And make sure Repeat Edge Pixels is checked and hit OK. Then again, let's create a layer mask and then fade it with the gradient tool. And then create a clipping mask for this one as well. You can always adjust the gradient and the shapes of the waves afterwards. Alright, now let's add some inner glow effect to give it some depth. So let's select the base layer and duplicate it with Command J and move it above the Chrome folder. Now let's get rid of these effects. and then add a new one down here and select Inner Glow. Set the blend mode to normal. Make it 60% opacity and 0% noise. And then select white for the color. Then set the size to 4 pixels and leave the rest as is and hit OK. And I'll rename this layer to Inner Glow. Alright, now let's adjust the color of the text so it fits better with the environment and it doesn't stick out so much. So select the layer group which contains the word retro, and then go down here to the adjustment layers and select solid color. I'll use the following hex value for the color: 24, 16, 55. Then I'll place the color layer right above the retro folder. And I'll create a clipping mask for the color. So I'll go to Layer and select Create Clipping Mask. And then just set the blending mode to exclusion and take down the opacity to around 50%. Now let's add an extra layer of outer glow behind the text. So I'll create a new layer down here, and I'll place it right above the background layer. And then rename it to Outer Glow. Now I'll bring up the brush tool by pressing B, and I'll right click on the canvas and make sure I have a soft edge brush selected. I'll make it pretty wide, so around 1200, 1300 pixels. And then set the foreground color to 38, 32, 4D. Then I'll just do this one large soft spot in the background. And I'll bring up the transform tool and flatten it towards the center by holding down Alt and compressing it down this way. So it doesn't have such a perfect circular shape and it feels more like it's adapted to the general shape of the word. Now, depending on your preference, you can bring down the opacity. I'll set it to about 50%. Alright, so we're almost done, guys. Now the last thing you might want to do is add a background image. I wanted something that fit the theme, so I just did a quick Google search for some sort of 80s retro grid and found this image which I thought fit perfectly. So find whichever image you want to use and save it to your desktop. From there you can just drag it to your workspace. Now I'll have it sit right on top of the background color layer and bring the opacity down to 60%. Now what I'm doing is specific to this background image. Depending on what image you're using, you might want to try different ways of integrating it, but at this point it's a case-by-case situation. Alright, so I'll resize the image to fit my canvas by bringing up the transform tool. And then I'll just smoothen this upper part to make the image blend with the rest. So I'll create a layer mask down here, and then select the brush tool and make sure the foreground color is set to black. And then I'll just brush off this top part so that everything blends together. Now you may want to resize the text to balance out the proportions. So I'll select the word outrun here, for example, and I'll make it bigger using the transform tool by pressing Command T. Now once again, I'm going to cheat a little and compress it towards the center just because I feel it looks better this way. And I'll bring it down just a bit because I like how the N slightly overlaps the R over here. Now I just want to take a second to thank Squarespace for sponsoring this video. With Squarespace, you can create your own beautiful looking website in no time, even if you have zero web design or coding experience. They offer a huge selection of professionally designed templates which you can easily customize to make it unique. You can even get your own domain directly from Squarespace, so it's really a one-stop shop for anyone trying to step up their online presence by getting their own website, custom portfolio, or online shop. I personally created 2 websites using Squarespace and I'm really happy with both of them. Their platform made the whole process incredibly easy, and they have great customer service to help you out if you have any questions. So if you want a free trial, make sure to click the link in the video description, and you'll even get a 10% discount for your membership. Alright guys, as usual, I'd really love to see what you guys do with this, so make sure to tag me on Instagram if you post your work over there. If you've enjoyed this video, feel free to drop a like, subscribe, or leave a comment. Guys, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.